Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Mornings with Marit. I'm excited today to have a couple of guests with us, and today we're going to be focusing on the storm and what that means for the industry in the legislative session. Um, just as a reminder, if you haven't joined our Facebook page, I hope you will. It's just look under Mornings with Marit and join us for other programs and sessions as we go. So let's get after it this morning. Here we go. I have two great guests, and I thank you very much, both of you, for being here. Many of you know, of course, Lee Loftis, our steadfast government affairs director, and he's going to be giving us some various updates as well today. And then thank you, Albert, for joining us. Albert Betts is the executive director for the Insurance Council of Texas, which is a nonprofit trade association representing the interests of over 400 property and casualty insurers doing business in Texas. So nice representation there. And he has an esteemed background, if you didn't know it. He has 30 years of experience as a lawyer, public policy administrator, and organizational leader, including prior experience as the Department of Insurance, the State Office of Risk Management, Texas Attorney General, and the former Texas Work Compensation Commission. So Albert, you've got quite a long list of accolades, and we love that you're joining us, and thank you for your partnership in the industry. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to pass to Lee so he can get us warmed up on the legislative session, which I hear he stayed up all night reading bills last night.
It's been interesting, Marit, and thank you. And Albert, thank you for being with us today and for all you and ICT do to support our members and all. The 87th session of the legislature is in day 58 today out of 140, but who's counting? As we all know, the session has gone from weird to weirder. We began the session knowing that there were going to be, it was going to be a different session because of COVID-19 restrictions. Jill and I and anybody that is going into the Capitol, we know the routine. We get over to the Capitol about 15 or 20 minutes early, and we go through the tent and do our swab and wait 15 minutes to pass the test before we get our armband to go in. And so that's the routine that it is, and it's eerily quiet in the Capitol. There's not near as many folks as a normal legislative session. All the school trips are canceled. All of the Big I days and the organizations coming to the Capitol are not happening this year, so it is different. But when we started the session, a couple of things that were obviously going to be on the forefront, COVID-19 and some legislation dealing with pandemics, and I'll talk a little bit more about specific bills later. But also the budget and redistricting were on the forefront as we got started. The budget, quite frankly, this last summer in the interim, they were talking about roughly a $4 to $5 billion budget deficit for this biennium, and they were looking at anywhere from a $13 to $14 billion deficit in the coming biennium, which is the budget they're working on now. This fall, the Controller Hager revised those down. The sales tax revenues as well as the oil and gas revenues, which are the key drivers of the Texas budget, were better than expected. I think the last I saw was the current budget year deficit is roughly $1 billion, and they're estimating about a $4 to $5 billion deficit budget going forward. That took a lot of pressure off of the legislature and having to make severe cuts. I know that education reform was huge last session, and there was a lot of concern, were they going to lose ground to the raises that the teachers got and all, and what I'm hearing is probably not. It's probably going to be a workable budget. I think they ask for roughly a 5% decrease in all the state budgets coming in, so that's not as bad as what they expected. Then we fast forward to February, I guess February 16th, in the winter storm, and I can tell you the priorities of nearly every committee and the priorities of the leadership of the governor and the lieutenant governor and the speaker have changed. And the emphasis now is revamping ERCOT, looking at the powers of the Public Utility Commission and their responsibility and role, and then an overall look at the Texas power grid. Those are the key topics right now. Anytime you're over there, look at the committee hearings or whatever, and there is a lot of conversation about how this is going to look moving forward. So it was very interesting as far as a change, what happened and all. So Matt, let's go to the next slide. When the winter storm hit, IIAT basically sent out a survey to their board members and some key committee members. And a couple of things that we also did is put out information to our members, which is to you agents, it's common knowledge. First off, mitigate any further damage. Do what you can to protect your property and save your property and all. Take photographs, keep receipts, and document what you're doing and all. And then last and most importantly, and these are some things that I talked to the House Insurance Committee this last week in the hearing about, is try to manage the expectations of your insureds. Resources are stretched thin with this storm, and it's one of those deals that nothing's going to happen as quickly as everybody would like this to happen. First off, there's a shortage of adjusters out there. You know, there is a limited amount of insurance resources. The insurance industry has done a good job in getting onto those and all. Secondly, there's a shortage of plumbers, and so to get the repair started and all that. And then there will be a shortage of contractors. And I know Albert's got some tips for us all about what to look for and be aware, be careful for them to pass on to your insureds as we're going. So then we ask our board and some committee people, how are we doing? And the overall consensus is about 15%, about 14% of homeowners and about 15% of commercial property policies as a average seem to be the numbers that were impacted by the storm. The next thing we ask is, you know, was the damage, next slide, Matt, was the damage extensive? Was it moderate, minimal, or is it too soon to know? It appears, based on the answers that we got, and again, also Albert's going to provide us some statistics that will back this up. Most of the respondents said it was in the moderate range. I think the numbers we're hearing is anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 per claim. Obviously, well above most deductibles and all, and so very manageable from that standpoint. And the last thing we ask is, how have the companies done? How responsive? 1 being unresponsive and 10 being very responsive. And I'm pleased to say that the general responses or the companies have done very well. And again, I shared this information with the House Insurance Committee last week. And Albert, please express to your members how much we appreciate them working with the agents, getting on the claims and all that. And again, the biggest problem from an agent standpoint is the filing of claims is probably subsided or ended by now. People know where they are and what it is, but now the managing the expectations and the fact that we've got the claim done and the companies can get the money into the consumer's hands, but that's not the end of the claims process. And that's going to be where, from an agent standpoint, we're going to have to really work to make certain that we continue to work with our customers and all to try to help them get back to where they were. So that's a real quick overview of kind of where we were and all in the initial response. So with that, I'll turn it over to Albert.
All right. Thank you, Lee. I appreciate it. First of all, thank you, Marit and IIAT, for having me join you all today. And appreciate all the work your members do, and Lee didn't think me to say this, but he does a job over at the Capitol on your behalf, and I've worked with him for a number of years in different capacities, and always a pleasure to deal with. I will say, out of everything you said, I was just happy to see that the industry was rated as very responsive so far by your agents. That's good news of what we're hearing from our folks. The word unprecedented has been thrown out quite a bit regarding this storm this past month. Um, like many people, 2020 was rough with COVID and everything else going on. But apparently 2021 said, hold my beer, because here I come and I'm going to do something even worse in Texas. So, in talking to the members last week about this, one thing I noted, I was born and raised in Denton. All my life and in Texas, we're used to cold weather. I think a phrase I used was cold snaps. They happen. We're used to them. It gets about 32. It might dip to the upper 20s. It's a couple of days and it's over. So as I watched this storm come, and probably many Texans, we didn't think it could get this bad. And we were wrong. It was a historic storm in terms of cold down here, in terms of time it was cold. More importantly, it was statewide in scope. We're used to hurricanes, which may hit 20, 30 counties, or hailstorms, a few counties at a time. But this affected the entire state, shut us down. I'm not going to get into the ERCOT issues, but really just put us into something. So when we talk about, I think it's the legislature.
Albert, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're getting some, I think because your camera's on, the sound isn't working that great. So I'm just going to ask us all to come off camera and see if that helps with the bandwidth. Can we try that?
Okay. We'll
try that.
Sorry.
And we apologize to folks.
Okay, my camera's off. Sound better?
Yeah, we'll check in here in just a second, and I apologize for that interruption.
No problem. So you missed all the great things I said, but regardless, this storm is historic in nature, and when we look at it across the state and talk about what it represented in terms of losses for this type of event in Texas, unprecedented and historic doesn't begin to describe it. Texas is used to dealing with catastrophe. That's not bragging, that's just a fact. We have hurricanes, tornadoes, hailstorms. You'll see on the screen, we've had hailstorms over $1 billion. Most recently back in 2019 up in Dallas, we had a $1.3 billion storm. And everybody remembers Harvey 4 years ago or so, how huge that was. Our largest national winter storm loss in any single year is a little over $2 billion. Keep in mind, that's national. This storm is estimated to be short of perhaps $10 billion in insured losses just here in Texas alone this year. And so that gives you some sense of how massive this was. Likely the biggest winter storm ever. Forget the biggest in Texas, but the biggest ever nationally. And that's a staggering loss for Texas insureds, as well as our insureds and customers around the state who have to deal with this. Next slide, please. So as we looked at claims, again, this is very early. The Department of Insurance actually issued a very brief data call to the top 25 riders last week to get some sense of claims and claims payments so far. But in polling our members informally, we have a general guess of at least 150 to 160,000 claims for this storm alone. And again, that was as of last week. Compare that to Harvey, where you had 160,000 residential and dwelling claims paid. So again, you get a sense of the scope of the loss that we're talking about here. That 150, 160,000 for this storm is primarily residential, at least from what we see so far, but obviously it will include a significant number of commercial losses, renter losses, as well as auto losses. Now, the auto loss is one thing we noticed. Thankfully, the storm kept people off the road. And as you all recall, up in Fort Worth, I think on February 11th, first day of the storm, we had that horrific accident up there, 130 cars and perhaps, I believe, 6 unfortunately killed in that. And that accident has already spawned litigation as folks are suing the trucking companies involved. And we'll talk a little bit later about what's happening with the trucking lawsuit issue in the legislature. but it crosses all lines, crosses all across the state. And so we are working with TDI to get the data together, but also working with our members to make sure they are as responsive as they can be and are handling those claims that are coming in, and getting adjusters on the ground. It's a storm this massive, losses this huge, and being statewide is obviously a challenge in terms of getting adjusters to help deal with claims. The companies were already geared up before the storm hit to get emergency adjusters in the state, and where needed, use non-resident adjusters to come in and help resolve those claims. We are hearing those claims are being handled. I'm assuming y'all are seeing the same. They're being handled sometimes, mostly in person, but sometimes virtually, just given the continuing concerns over COVID-19. So I think it's a mix of what we've heard, that virtual claims process is working. People are adjusting, but I know I'm trying to deal with this as quickly as possible. Next. As we've gone through this process, ICT, if you've seen the media reports, has been engaged with the media across the state and across the nation and answering questions about this storm. What does it mean? What does it mean for consumers? What does it mean for the state? What does it mean economically? So there's some common questions we try to address, and I'm sure you all have the same questions as agent out there. Consumers want to know, what is the claim process? How does it work? How quickly will I get a check? Do I get a check for ALE before I get a check for my repairs if any are needed? So walking consumers through that process, explaining what companies will do, which checks you'll likely get paid for first, for example, ALE, and others that may depend upon examination of the damage and some decisions on recoupable amounts. A lot of coverage questions. As we talk to our companies, the amount of frozen pipe and water damage claims from this storm alone are anywhere from 100 to 300 times what they see in a normal year. For example, a company has told us they may see 75 of these in a year. They've got over 30,000 of these claims right now. And so it's staggering what it has done to what is normally not a huge loss here in the state. Policy forms vary, coverage varies across companies. Generally, most people have policies that cover frozen pipes and water damage, sudden discharge in one way or another. But as folks look at their coverage, look at their deductibles, try to determine if they've got some slab damage, what's covered and what's not. We've done our best to try to describe how that coverage works, what it looks like, and always, either referring the consumer, if there's such a question, back to the agent, back to y'all, or to their insurance company to try to resolve that. Commercial, not as many questions, I think, as those claims have come in. Those commercial customers are looking at their business interruption coverage and how that applies. And then questions regarding if they were shut down due to the blackout rather than actual damage, what does that mean for potential recovery? And then one big issue we've talked about, Lee touched on this, is repairs. This is going to take time, given the scope of it. The amount of contractors, plumbers in particular, that are available is just going to be stretched thin. We heard last week, a week before, folks were having to book plumbers who couldn't show up until April. Just because of the demand. None of the governor's issued orders to help ease entry for plumbers apprentices to begin working in the system, and out-of-state plumbers have been brought in as well. But big demand for that, and trying to ease or at least help explain some frustration that may come from that process. That's going to take time, and it's part of the process of recovery. The other big issue after any large storm is fraud. We spent quite a bit of time talking and making sure consumers understand that there are people out there who are going to look to take advantage of this situation, as they do after any major hurricane or tornado or hail event in this state. What you should do as a consumer in terms of checking references, checking Better Business Bureau, asking around to others who may have had repairs. But above all, I think the one message we've emphasized, and we talked about this in-house insurance, don't give the money up front, because often the repair folks are going to take it and disappear. And then you've got to go through the legal process to try to get some recovery. So I think our message has been, to the extent we can, trying to help consumers, guide them through something that's probably been very traumatic, with damage in their homes and maybe days without power and water, but not to make the claims process any more traumatic for them. Next slide, please. The Department of Insurance has been very, very cooperative and helpful in this process. Obviously, they were gearing up as well. And so we've had conversations with them about issues they're seeing with claims handling, just so we can share it back with our members. And at the same time, talking and explaining generally how our coverages may work or may not work. A couple of weeks ago, the department put out various bulletins to the insurance community, reminding them of certain requirements that exist within the law already, or rules, and laying out expectations that companies, consider what these consumers have been through, and try to, when possible, provide, for example, some premium payment relief, reminding carriers to use and apply appropriately for emergency adjusters, the requirements for non-resident adjusters, and then, although we don't think this is needed, but at least reminding carriers that there are existing laws that restrict withdrawals or reduce write-ins immediately after disaster. There's processes companies have to go through if they decide to make that. I haven't heard any of that happen yet, but I think TDI just wanted to make sure companies understood if you did decide what you needed to do to reduce your writings. And then claims handling deadlines. After any disaster, there's a 15-day extension that the department can declare for companies if needed, given the scope and number and volume of claims, to help get those resolved at least timely, instead of 15 days, now 30 days. So companies are doing what they can, and the TDI bulletins have been very helpful. There's one other bulletin that came out Tuesday, reminding the carrier community that some consumers may have not had the ability to control the temperature in their home, given the blackouts, as well as reminding that some consumers may not have been able to cut off their water, given the difficulty in getting outside, or the water valve was frozen. And I think that was designed to simply, where there may be some questions arising about coverage, due to policy language on maintaining reasonable efforts to maintain a certain temperature in the home, or reasonable efforts to cut off the water supply. I think the department had heard of a few instances where that issue's been raised, and it was a reminder to the industry to, again, try to consider the situation that consumers were dealing with during this terrible, terrible event. Next slide, please. So legislatively, Lee was right on. The session switched very quickly. ERCOT, the blackouts, the storm, the response became front and center. And so last week, the industry, the agents, and others were called over to talk about what's happened so far and what will be done going forward. And part of that, a big part of that legislative discussion was, again, consumer education. How do we explain, how does the industry, how do agents, how do others explain to consumers what they need to know, understand better what could be done to fight fraud. And the Department of Insurance has a fraud unit dedicated to that process, and has prosecutors located in 5 counties, I believe I recall. 5 counties that can help prosecute insurance fraud. So I think a lot of interest will be there. One thing that came up that I don't have on here is, does the state regulate roofers and other contractors to help manage and help prevent fraud? Now, I think the industry quickly explained that the state does not regulate roofers. There's been multiple sessions trying to at least come up with some either regulation or a registration, but that's in defeat every time. So I think a bill is filed this week to at least regulate re-roofers, and not be new home roofers, but folks out doing repairs. So I think that discussion is going to pop back up this session about who's watching the folks out repairing the most expensive part of a home. There are some counties that have regulations, ordinances in place requiring roofers to register in that county, but there is no statewide regulation of roofers. So keep an eye on that and see if that maybe changes how re-roofing is done in this state. And then finally, a big question from our members, from the legislative members, was, can the insurance industry pay this? Short answer is yes, they can. The industry is strong in this state. TDI regulates the solvency of the industry to make sure companies have the ability to pay claims. But I think the issue here is this is clearly unexpected. We don't get winter storms like this, and so from a catastrophe claim payment perspective, this is going to be difficult, especially with the rest of the year still potential for hail, tornadoes, and hurricanes in this state. But I think our companies are positioned to handle it. They have the capital in place and the reinsurance in place, and we'll talk a little bit about what that may mean shortly. But part of what TDI also does is make sure the companies are solvent in place, and I think we're good on that. And then finally, just a lot of legislative interest on the coverages and how they work and why they work the way they do. And we did have some media pushback on the notion of there's a variety of coverages out there. But I think y'all are well aware our position is consumers have choices. We have a competitive market in this state. And as long as we can help educate consumers about what's the best choice for them for their risk, it's good to have different policy alternatives out there for them. Next slide, please. And then finally, I'll close with, I'll call it the big picture questions that are still going to be ongoing even after session, is the reinsurance impact. And I'll talk to some reinsurance folks. They're very much interested in what's happening in Texas and how much this will ultimately cost. And as companies are negotiating their reinsurance treaties this year, this storm will play a huge role. Similarly for rates, a lot of question about what happens to insurance rates. And companies are going to have to evaluate what does the storm mean long term. And I mean in terms of, do we expect this to happen every year? Is this a one-time aberration? Rates, as y'all are well aware, are not just based on one event, but this is going to be a significant loss. So I think the reinsurance question and the rate question will be something determined over time. ERCOT has been sued, and this was before the storm hit, challenging their sovereign immunity, which basically means you can't sue them. They're treated like a state agency. But that is before the Texas Supreme Court, and a lot of reinsurance interest in what happens with that lawsuit, and I don't think that'll be resolved before session ends, but it bears watching for future events. And then the lawsuits that are inevitably going to come. If you watch TV, at least here in Austin, the Austin area, we see a lot of TV ads already to sue your energy company over the rolling blackouts. I mentioned earlier, we've seen lawsuits already filed over the huge accident up in Fort Worth. And as there's coverage questions or maybe denials of claims, we can also expect to see some lawsuits filed against the insurance company. So there's some long tail ramifications of this storm, but I think the industry and the agents have done a great job of responding to something none of us expected to be working on this year. And as I caution everybody, we've survived the storm, we're in recovery, but now we've got to keep an eye out for the hail and tornado that typically hits us this time of year. So I think we're ready, we're strong, and appreciate the cooperation of the agent community in responding to our fellow Texans in this time of need. I believe that concludes my presentation. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Albert. That was very informative, and always appreciate being kept up to speed as to the industry issues and all. So let's talk about some of the key issues that IIAT is working on, and I referenced some of them earlier, but Senate Bill 6, as I mentioned, is our COVID business liability protection bill, and it is being carried by Senator Kelly Hancock, who is the chair of Business and Commerce. We've worked very closely with Senator Hancock in the past and all, and in the language of the bill is very straightforward. It basically gives business entities liability protection from COVID claims if the business can prove that they followed CDC or governor's guidelines or guidelines of the city municipality, if they made a good faith effort in trying to follow the guidelines that were put out, then they will have business liability protection. Same way with the medical profession. I hadn't really thought about this until it was brought up, but the medical products, the face guards and the eye guards and all the things that are unnormal a year ago or unusual to us, have become commonplace and all. So there are liability protections for those as well as the first responders and the medical community. So a very well thought out bill, one that Texans for Lawsuit Reform and the Texas Civil Justice League, both of which IIAT are very involved with, have taken the lead on this, as well as House Bill 19, and they are moving forward. We're very pleased that the Senate Bill 6 is a priority of all the leadership. The governor made it an emergency item, so it will move very quickly. The lieutenant governor had it, obviously with a low bill number, Senate Bill 6, it's a priority for him and the speaker as well. So we feel good that this will be something that we'll be able to achieve this session. House Bill 19 is a commercial auto tort reform bill. Many of y'all expressed to us over the last year to 18 months about the obvious explosion of litigation that has occurred in Texas. It's actually occurred nationwide, but in listening to the some 18 hours of testimony this week, it appears that Texas is one of the worst states for this explosion. And the term nuclear verdicts has been used, and that is one that has really caused the main problem from a standpoint of the huge verdicts that juries are being awarded. I won't get into the details of this bill because in listening to the legislation, it is a lot of legal terms that are being argued as to the change in the legal definitions, the legal ways that cases can be presented and evidence that can be heard and all. This bill was heard in jurisprudence and or Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee, not in House Insurance Committee. But Chairman Leach did a great job of allowing pretty much all the testimony that was needed and wanted to be presented. There's some work to be done. I believe he pointed out about 6 different pieces of the legislation that still need work. So it's a work in progress, but hopefully we'll continue to move forward and at least give the industry and the defendant the ability to plead their case more adequately and possibly avoid these huge nuclear verdicts and all. Another interesting bill that we've been working with the industry on is House Bill 2547. It's termed the Commercial Lines Modernization Bill. I believe there are 34 states that have passed something similar to this. And what it does is there's 17 lines of business that would be affected by this, such as cyber liability, directors and officers, excess liability, EPL coverages, some of those ancillary type coverages that are not the standard GL, work comp, property, etc., would have less oversight. If this passed, would have less oversight by the Department of Insurance on rate and form. And what it would do is allow companies to file their own forms and more quickly as things come about, as is, the case with a COVID liability policy or whatever, that things that are unusual and need to be something property, the policy forms being brought to the department. A lot of times it takes months, if not longer, to get those approved. So this would allow much more flexibility to the company, and something that we're supporting and all. As far as TWIA, there's a number of TWIA bills, but the one that is probably the most interesting and the one that we are still looking into is House Bill 1864. It would change the WPI-8 certification and move it back from the Department of Insurance back to TWIA. It's interesting because this was changed last session and moved from TWIA to the Department of Insurance. And I've talked to a number of our coastal agents, and we are not in consensus as to whether moving it back would be the right thing or the wrong thing. There are things that the department do, such as a database that holds these WPI-8 certifications and the WPI-8C certification, so it's much easier for the consumer and the agent to get that information. And also, that's one that we will be watching very closely and all. So I also would like to encourage everyone to go to our IIAT website, the new website, and look under the advocacy tab, and you will see legislative sessions and the 87th legislative session. There's a list of every bill that we are tracking currently. And if there's anything on there that you have questions about or would like to comment on, Jill Douglas, who works with me, and myself and Jim Gavin, we'd all be happy to discuss these with you and answer any questions that you might have. And also, if there's bills that you have interest in that you have not, that are not listed there that we're working on, then contact us on those. We can look them up and get back to you on those. But finally, I want to put a pitch in for Impact. Our political action committee, we're about to kick off our drive, and this is what allows us to support business-minded legislators that make the laws that we all live by and all. And IIAT and Impact has always been a force at the Capitol, and this gives us the ability to support good candidates that we work with all the time. So be watching for that, and we will be working on our meeting our goals in the next 2 to 3 months. Marit?
Great, thank you, Lee, and thank you for everyone participating. There were a couple questions that came in, and what we'll do is we'll just respond individually to those folks because there's some details in there that we may have to do a little research. So thank you for your engagement on that. The other thing we want to remind you of is that there is a Trusted Choice Disaster Relief Fund that's available to all IIT members through our National Association, your membership through us. We've had a few folks reach out and get grants for that, for lost perishable food and living expenses and so forth. So if it's not covered by something, there are grants available. And you can see on the screen, you can either go to iiaba.org and look up the Disaster Relief Fund, or you can email Madeline if you want to take a picture of the screen. And it's also available on our website to find more information. So please make sure you take advantage of those resources as members of IIAT. And then finally, I just want to thank Lee and Albert very much for your time and preparation today. And if folks have additional questions, they can either email myself or Lee, or I'm sure Albert can be reached as well. And we'll be happy to field those as time goes on. And so we're going to wrap up today. And I want to remind you that our next Mornings with Marit will be on April 8th, and you can register for that on our website. We're actually going to be interviewing agents and carrier folks to ask them what has happened positive. COVID's not been a good thing, but we have learned some things out of it and made some great practices of improvements. And we'll also have a labor attorney on there, Ann Price, to talk about the vaccine and how you can approach that from a standpoint of an employer. So with that, have a great day. Thank you for joining us this morning, and stay safe. And luckily, we're much warmer than a couple weeks ago. Thanks, everyone.